Welcome to this gentle exploration of one of history's most fascinating minds. As you prepare for rest, I invite you to join me in contemplating the inner world of Nikola Tesla, a man whose thoughts illuminated not just our understanding of electricity, but of human potential itself. Tonight we'll walk quietly through the landscapes of Tesla's mind, his perceptions, his visions, not as biographers or scholars, but as thoughtful observers seeking wisdom in the patterns of a remarkable life. There's no need to remember anything we discuss, no requirement to follow every thread of thought. Instead, I encourage you to find a comfortable position, to allow your breathing to find its natural rhythm, and to let these reflections become a gentle backdrop to your own journey toward rest. As we explore Tesla's world, you may find your mind drifting, perhaps towards sleep, perhaps toward your own reflections. This is perfectly natural and entirely welcome. The purpose of our time together is not information, but tranquility. Not learning, but gentle contemplation. So now, as you settle more deeply into comfort, let us begin our unhurried exploration of the mind that once imagined electricity flowing freely through the air, the consciousness that perceived patterns others could not see, and the heart that beat with both solitude and universal connection. Entry Reflections. In the quiet pre-dawn hours, when most of Belgrade still slept, young Nikola would often wake to see his father's candle burning at the small wooden desk by the window. Reverend Tesla, a man of faith and intellect, would be writing his Sunday sermon, the soft scratch of his pen against paper, forming a gentle rhythm in the otherwise silent home. It was here, watching his father's dedication to both thought and faith, that Tesla first encountered the power of devoted contemplation. These early morning moments, wrapped in stillness and soft candlelight, would later echo in Tesla's own patterns of solitary work, creating a bridge between childhood observation and adult practice that spanned decades of innovation. Throughout his life, Tesla developed an unusual relationship with the subtle energies of storms. While others sought shelter from lightning, he would sometimes stand at his window, watching electrical discharges illuminate the sky. He described these moments not with fear, but with a sense of recognition, as if greeting an old friend whose language he was slowly learning to translate. This comfort with natural forces that frightened others reflected his larger pattern of finding harmony where others perceived chaos. The arc of lightning against dark clouds became for him not just a meteorological event, but a visual poem, written in the precise language of electrical potential, a language he was uniquely suited to understand. Tesla's hands moved differently than those of other men. Observers often noted the unusual precision of his gestures, the way his fingers would trace invisible patterns in the air as he contemplated a problem. He rarely carried pen or paper, preferring instead to construct his inventions completely within his mind, turning mental gears, adjusting conceptual levers, visualizing currents flowing through imagined pathways. This practice began in childhood and developed through necessity during periods of illness when physical resources were unavailable. What started as a compensation became a strength, the ability to build, test, and perfect designs within the workshop of his imagination before a single physical component was assembled. In his quarters at the Waldorf Astoria, where Tesla lived for many years, he established gentle rituals that structured his days. Each evening, precisely at 8, he would dine alone, requesting that his napkins be replaced several times during the meal, each one used only briefly before being set aside. What might seem to others as peculiarity was, for Tesla, a necessary creation of order, a small realm of control that allowed his mind the freedom to explore vast theoretical territories. These personal patterns, maintained with quiet insistence, formed a stable framework from which his more revolutionary thinking could safely emerge. As a young man studying in Graz, Tesla walked the same path through the city park each afternoon, not from habit alone, but because the precise number of steps helped him think. He counted them silently. 192 from the University Gate to the Old Oak, 78 more to the Stone Bridge, 53 beyond to the eastern exit. These numerical patterns created a gentle mathematical rhythm, that allowed his conscious mind to settle while deeper thoughts arranged themselves below awareness. Years later, when solving complex problems, he would sometimes pace in precise rectangles, 33 steps long, 11 steps wide, recreating the mathematical certainty that had always brought his thinking into focus. When working with electrical currents, Tesla described experiencing synesthetic perceptions, seeing specific colors in response to particular frequencies, hearing soft tones when certain voltages were applied. These cross-sensory experiences were never shared in his formal scientific papers, but appeared occasionally in his private notes. The 60 Hz frequency commonly used in North American power systems appeared to him as a deep indigo blue, a color that would fill his awareness when standing near operational equipment. This unusual perceptual gift allowed him to experience technology not just as intellectual concept, but as sensory reality, creating an intimacy with electrical phenomena that few others could comprehend. During periods of intense creation, Tesla would often forget to eat, not from carelessness but from complete immersion. Time itself seemed to change its nature around him, hours compressing into moments of insight or expanding into contemplative eternities. Those who worked with him described how he could stand motionless before a problem for unusual stretches, barely seeming to breathe, his attention focused on elements invisible to others. Then, without warning, he would return to motion, often with the solution fully formed. This relationship with time, this ability to step partly outside its conventional flow, became one of his most powerful yet least understood capabilities, allowing his mind to work in rhythms uniquely suited to discovery rather than constrained by social expectations. Deep explorations, early influences. The Serbian countryside where Tesla spent his childhood was marked by rolling hills and open skies, landscapes that invited contemplation of vastness. His earliest memories included lying in summer grass, watching clouds form and dissolve against blue expanses. This early experience of natural impermanence, of forms appearing, transforming, and disappearing, created in him a comfort with transition that would later manifest as scientific innovation. Where others sought permanent solutions, Tesla understood the value of flow, of energy in motion, of systems that breathed and changed rather than remaining fixed in a single state. His mother, Juka, possessed remarkable manual dexterity, creating intricate needlework without written patterns. Young Nikola would watch her fingers move, seemingly guided by an internal vision that required no external reference. Later in life, when describing his own process of mental invention, Tesla would reference his mother's ability, noting that she crafted from imagination just as he would eventually build from visualization. This maternal inheritance of creating from internal rather than external reference points became central to his approach to innovation. In the orthodox tradition that surrounded Tesla's childhood, icons were understood not as mere images, but as windows into deeper realities. The young boy spent many hours in the local church, observing how light moved across these sacred illustrations, how certain angles of illumination seemed to bring figures to life, while others rendered them flat and distant. This early understanding of the relationship between light, perception, and meaning later informed his work with both visible illumination and invisible wavelengths, always with an awareness that what we see depends greatly on how we see it. The death of his older brother Daniel in a riding accident cast a shadow across Tesla's childhood that would never fully lift. Occurring when Nikola was only 7, this loss created in him a heightened awareness of life's fragility and an unusual relationship with mortality. His parents' grief became a palpable presence in their home, teaching him that invisible forces could be as real and influential as physical ones. This early encounter with absence shaped his later comfort with unseen energies, with forces that could not be directly observed, but whose effects could transform the material world. The books in his father's library became Tesla's first laboratory, a place where ideas could be extracted, examined, and recombined. Unlike many children who approached reading as obligation, he experienced texts as conversations with minds, separated from him by time and space, but made present through written word. He read not only for information, but for companionship, finding in authors' thoughts the intellectual communion that his remote village could not provide. This relationship with books as living entities rather than inert objects prepared him for his later ability to engage with abstract concepts as if they were tangible presences. During his formative years, Tesla encountered a physics teacher who performed simple demonstrations with static electricity, rubbing glass rods with silk, causing small objects to attract or repel one another. While other students viewed these as amusing tricks, Tesla perceived something more profound. He later wrote of seeing in these modest experiments the poem of electricity, a phrase revealing how even then he experienced scientific phenomena, not just analytically but aesthetically. This perception of natural forces as possessing both mathematical precision and inherent beauty would remain central to his approach throughout his career. The migratory birds that passed over his childhood home each spring and autumn created in Tesla an awareness of natural navigation, of the ability of living creatures to orient themselves through invisible fields. He would watch their formations, move across the sky, maintaining perfect alignment without visible communication. Years later, when working with electromagnetic fields, he would occasionally reference these childhood observations, noting that what humans built with complex equipment, nature had long accomplished through more subtle means. This appreciation for biological systems as technological models influenced his understanding of how human innovation might align with rather than oppose natural patterns. Mental processes. Tesla's thought process differed from conventional scientific method in its foundation. While most of his contemporaries built knowledge through incremental experimentation, Tesla often began with complete visions that arrived in moments of unusual mental clarity. He described experiencing sudden illuminations wherein entire systems appeared to him fully formed. Generators, motors, transmission methods, all functioning together in detailed mental models. These moments typically arrived not during active problem-solving but in states of relaxed contemplation, walking in parks, listening to music, or hovering between wakefulness and sleep. The preparation of his workspace followed patterns as precise as mathematical formulas. Before beginning any physical work, Tesla would clean his laboratory tools with methodical care, polishing each instrument, aligning components at exact angles, ensuring that all unnecessary objects were removed from his field of vision. This ritual was not mere orderliness, but a form of mental preparation, a clearing of external space that mirrored the internal clarity he sought to achieve. Assistants sometimes found these preparations tedious, but Tesla understood them as essential foundations for the delicate perceptions his work required. Throughout his life, Tesla maintained an unusual relationship with physical objects, often experiencing them as possessing subtle energies or characteristics beyond their material properties. He selected his laboratory equipment not only for technical specifications, but for what he described as their temperament, an intuitive sense of how each component would behave under various conditions. This approach, blending precise measurement with intuitive understanding, allowed him to work with electrical systems as if engaging with living collaborators rather than inert tools. Sleep, for Tesla, was not a simple biological necessity, but a complex creative state. He trained himself to rest in brief intervals, claiming that 3 or 4 hours per night sufficed. But these periods were not unconscious. Instead, he described hovering in hypnagogic states where logical constraints loosened and conceptual connections formed more freely. Rather than fighting insomnia, he cultivated a form of controlled wakefulness within rest, a delicate balance that allowed his unconscious mind to process problems while his conscious awareness remained partly engaged to observe the results. His visualization capabilities extended far beyond normal imagination. Tesla could project complete mental models with such precision that he could simulate their operation over time, observing wear patterns, identifying friction points, and making adjustments before creating physical prototypes. This mental testing environment saved countless hours of material experimentation, but came with personal cost. The intensity of these visualizations sometimes blurred the boundary between internal models and external reality, creating occasional perceptual experiences that others might consider hallucinations, but which Tesla understood as simply the overflow of his powerful imaginative faculty. Rather than relying on mathematical calculation alone, Tesla often developed an intuitive sense of numerical relationships, particularly regarding frequency, resonance, and electrical harmonics. While he could perform complex equations when needed, his deeper insights typically came through what he called feeling the numbers, a synesthetic experience wherein mathematical relationships manifested as sensory impressions. Certain equations produced specific colors in his awareness. Optimal ratios created sensations of balance or rightness. This integration of calculation and perception allowed him to navigate complex problems through multiple channels of understanding simultaneously. The rhythm of Tesla's thinking followed cyclical rather than linear patterns. He recognized that his insights emerged, according to natural cognitive tides, periods of intense clarity, followed by necessary fallow times when apparent progress halted. Rather than fighting these cycles, he learned to align his activities with them, focusing on detailed implementation during periods of analytical strength and allowing his mind to wander more freely when intuitive connections were stronger. This acknowledgement of natural mental rhythms created sustainable patterns of innovation that prevented the burnout common among his equally brilliant but less self-aware contemporaries. In his laboratory work, Tesla developed a practice he called listening to the apparatus, a form of attention that blended sensory observation with intuitive awareness. Beyond monitoring gauges or measurements, he would attune himself to the subtle sounds, vibrations, and even the distinctive odors of equipment in operation. Assistants sometimes observed him standing completely still beside running machinery, eyes closed, head slightly tilted, absorbing information through channels beyond conventional observation. This multi-sensory approach to understanding technological systems reflected his broader belief that knowledge comes not just through analysis, but through relationship. Inner challenges. Despite his brilliant mind, or perhaps because of it, Tesla struggled throughout his life with periods of sensory overwhelm. Certain sounds became physically painful. Particular patterns of light could trigger disorientation. Rather than seeking to eliminate these sensitivities, he developed accommodation strategies, creating controlled environments where he could regulate sensory input precisely. His preference for darkened rooms, specific acoustic conditions, and minimal decoration reflected not mere eccentricity, but necessary self-care. The creation of spaces where his unusually responsive nervous system could function optimally rather than being constantly overwhelmed by stimuli others might barely notice. The gap between Tesla's visualized inventions and their physical implementation often created periods of profound frustration. What functioned perfectly in the precision of his mind sometimes proved difficult to manifest through the imperfect materials available. During these moments when reality resisted his vision, Tesla would sometimes retreat into complete silence, not speaking for days as he reconciled the perfect with the possible. These silent periods, though concerning to associates, were not evidence of defeat, but necessary recalibrations, mental work that allowed him to transform disappointment into adaptation without abandoning the essence of his original insight. Throughout his career, Tesla maintained a complex relationship with financial concerns. While clearly understanding the necessity of funding for his work, he struggled to integrate practical business considerations with his pursuit of discovery. Inventions that might have made him wealthy were sometimes abandoned when his interest shifted to new problems, not from carelessness, but from genuine inability to prioritize monetary concerns over intellectual fascination. This pattern created practical hardships, but reflected his underlying belief that discovery itself was the primary value, with financial reward serving only as a means toward further exploration rather than an end worthy of pursuit for its own sake. Tesla's relationship with sleep became increasingly complicated in his later years. The same mind that could solve complex electromagnetic problems also generated persistent thoughts that delayed rest. He developed elaborate rituals to quiet his mental activity, repeating specific poems, visualizing peaceful scenes or mentally reciting numbers in perfect rhythm. These practices reflected his understanding that the same mental intensity that enabled his work also required conscious management to prevent it from becoming an obstacle to necessary restoration. The boundary between his gift and his burden often blurred, requiring constant attention to maintain the delicate balance between productive thought and peaceful silence. The public perception of Tesla as merely eccentric often wounded him more deeply than he acknowledged. While comfortable with solitude, he was not immune to the human need for understanding. In private correspondence, he occasionally expressed frustration that his carefully considered practices were dismissed as peculiarities, rather than recognized as thoughtful adaptations to his unique cognitive patterns. This gap between self-understanding and public perception created a subtle but persistent melancholy, a quiet grief for the recognition not of his achievements, but of his full humanity, with all its carefully calibrated adjustments to an unusual mind. As Tesla aged, he confronted the physical limitations that began to constrain his work. Having relied so heavily on perfect visual memory and mental simulation, the natural changes in cognitive function that accompany aging presented unique challenges. He developed compensatory practices, creating more external records, adapting his visualization techniques, and sometimes modifying problems to accommodate his changing capabilities. These adjustments reflected not surrender but adaptation. The same problem-solving approach he had applied to external challenges now turned inward toward the challenge of time's passage through his own consciousness. Perhaps most poignantly, Tesla struggled with the paradox of connection. His mind operated at frequencies that made conventional social interaction difficult, yet he deeply valued human relationship. He developed carefully structured forms of engagement, preferring formal dinners with clear expectations, professional collaborations with defined parameters, and correspondence that allowed him to compose his thoughts carefully before sharing them. These weren't walls built to exclude others, but bridges designed to enable connection across the unusual gap between his perception and common experience. Evidence not of disinterest in humanity, but of dedication to finding pathways toward meaningful exchange despite differences in cognitive landscape. Wisdom patterns. Throughout his life, Tesla maintained an unusual relationship with what might be called the poetics of invention. While his work was grounded in precise science, he frequently described experiencing moments of pure aesthetic appreciation for the elegance of natural forces. The perfect curve of an electromagnetic wave, the precise mathematics of resonant frequency, the delicate balance of opposing currents. These technical realities were, for him, expressions of beauty as legitimate as any painting or symphony. This integration of scientific precision with aesthetic appreciation created a distinctive approach to innovation, one that sought solutions satisfying not just functional requirements, but deeper principles of harmony and elegance. Tesla developed a philosophy of technology that differed significantly from the extractive or dominative approaches common in his era. He consistently envisioned systems that worked with, rather than against, natural patterns, technologies that amplified existing energies rather than forcing new pathways through brute force. This perspective emerged clearly in his preference for alternating current, which he described as flowing more naturally than direct current, more closely aligned with the rhythmic patterns found throughout the natural world. Behind his technical specifications lay a deeper intuition that the most enduring human innovations would be those that harmonized with rather than opposed the fundamental structures of reality. Time, for Tesla, was neither purely linear nor simply cyclical but something more complex, a medium through which consciousness moved in multiple directions simultaneously. He described occasionally experiencing moments of temporal transparency, when the boundaries between past, present, and future seemed momentarily permeable. These experiences were not mystical claims, but observations about consciousness itself, reflections on how the mind moves through temporal reality in ways not always captured by conventional understanding. This perspective informed his patient approach to discovery, his willingness to allow ideas to develop according to their own necessary timelines, rather than forcing them into predetermined schedules. Throughout his career, Tesla maintained a distinctive relationship with the concept of ownership, particularly regarding ideas. While pragmatically pursuing patents to enable his work, he simultaneously held that truly important discoveries belonged fundamentally to humanity rather than to individuals. This philosophy became most evident in his later years when he spoke of certain technologies being perhaps too consequential to be controlled by any single person or organization. This perspective reflected a broader understanding of innovation as a conversation between human consciousness and natural possibility, with the inventor serving as translator rather than creator, revealing what already exists rather than generating something entirely new. Tesla's approach to failure differed significantly from conventional scientific method. While acknowledging the informational value of unsuccessful experiments, he placed equal emphasis on their emotional impact, recognizing that disappointment could either block further progress or open alternative pathways depending on how it was processed. He developed personal practices for metabolizing experimental disappointments, often taking long walks immediately after unsuccessful tests, allowing natural movement to process both intellectual and emotional responses simultaneously. This integration of cognitive and affective dimensions created resilience that sustained his work through inevitable setbacks without diminishing his willingness to envision ambitious possibilities. In his personal notes, Tesla occasionally reflected on what he termed the observer effect in his own consciousness, how his attention itself seemed to influence the phenomena he studied. While maintaining rigorous experimental protocols, he simultaneously developed a nuanced understanding of the inseparability of observer and observed, particularly in his work with subtle electrical effects. This perspective predated quantum observations about measurement and reflected an intuitive grasp of the participatory nature of scientific inquiry. Rather than claiming perfect objectivity, he cultivated careful awareness of how his presence shaped his observations, an unusually reflective stance for a scientist of his era. As Tesla aged, he developed an increasingly refined philosophy regarding complexity and simplicity. His earliest designs often featured numerous components, demonstrations of technical virtuosity and comprehensive understanding. His later work moved steadily toward elegant minimalism, seeking solutions with fewer elements but more profound integration with natural principles. This evolution reflected deeper understanding rather than simplification, a recognition that the most powerful technologies often emerged not from elaboration, but from identifying and amplifying essential patterns already present in nature. This trajectory from complexity toward essence reflected his maturing perception that human innovation succeeds not by imposing complexity, but by aligning with existing elegance. Throughout his life, Tesla maintained a complex relationship with language itself. Working across multiple tongues, Serbian, German, French, English, he developed awareness of how different linguistic structures enabled different forms of thought. He occasionally noted that certain technical concepts came to him in specific languages, with some ideas forming more naturally in one linguistic framework than another. This multilingual thinking created cognitive flexibility, allowing him to approach problems from varying conceptual angles depending on which linguistic framework he employed. This awareness of language as not merely communicative but formative, of thought itself reflected his broader sensitivity to how containers shape what they contain. Universal connections. The patterns Tesla perceived in electricity found echoes in his observations of human social systems. He occasionally noted similarities between the flow of electrical current through conductive networks and the movement of information through human communities, observing that both followed paths of least resistance, both required proper insulation to prevent energy loss, and both functioned optimally with neither too much resistance nor too little. These observations were not mere metaphors, but recognitions of pattern similarity across different scales of reality, reflections of his broader understanding that certain organizational principles manifest throughout natural and human systems, regardless of specific content or context. Throughout his work, Tesla maintained awareness of the intimate connection between energy and information, understanding that electrical patterns could serve not just as power sources, but as communication channels. This perspective anticipated later cybernetic insights by decades and emerged from his observation that the same electromagnetic principles that moved physical motors could also carry encoded meaning. This dual perception of electricity as simultaneously energetic and informational reflected his broader recognition that the universe itself might be understood as patterns of energy encoding patterns of meaning, a perspective that transcended the conventional separations between power and communication, between physical force and symbolic representation. Tesla's relationship with light extended beyond its technical properties to philosophical contemplation. Having worked extensively with both visible and invisible wavelengths, he developed nuanced understanding of human perception as receiving only narrow bands of available reality. This recognition created in him a certain epistemological humility, an awareness that all human knowledge represents selective interaction with a much broader spectrum of existence. Rather than limiting his thinking, this perspective inspired methodical exploration of what lay beyond immediate perception, not through mystical means but through careful extension of sensing capabilities through technological amplification, always with awareness that even these extensions captured only portions of a more complex whole. The principle of resonance featured prominently not just in Tesla's technical work, but in his understanding of human consciousness. He observed that minds, like electrical circuits, seem to operate at particular frequencies, some naturally, attuned to each other, others requiring careful adjustment to communicate effectively. This perspective informed his approach to collaboration, his selection of assistants, and his navigation of professional relationships. Beyond technical application, resonance became for him a model of human connection, a recognition that meaningful exchange depends not just on proximity, but on complementary receptivity, on the careful tuning that allows separate systems to vibrate in harmony, rather than create interference. Throughout his career, Tesla maintained awareness of the paradoxical relationship between specialization and integration. While necessarily focusing on electrical phenomena, he consistently placed these studies within broader contexts, considering their relationship to mechanical systems, to biological processes, to social structures. This integrative approach reflected his understanding that the most significant discoveries often emerge not from deeper isolation of specific domains, but from recognition of patterns that cross conventional boundaries. Nature itself, he frequently noted, does not organize according to human academic disciplines, but operates through principles that manifest across what we artificially separate into distinct fields of study. Tesla's perspective on technology's purpose evolved significantly through his lifetime. His early career focused primarily on capability, on expanding what human systems could accomplish through electrical innovation. His later reflections increasingly emphasized alignment, considering not just what could be done, but what should be done, not just efficiency, but harmony. This evolution reflected his growing recognition that technological power without corresponding wisdom creates imbalance, that human capacity had developed more rapidly than human maturity. These concerns, expressed privately rather than publicly, revealed the contemplative dimensions of a mind known primarily for its inventive capacity. The concept of scale fascinated Tesla throughout his career, particularly the ways certain patterns maintain integrity across vastly different magnitudes. He observed similarities between electrical microcurrents and lightning strikes, between small electromagnetic oscillations and planetary magnetic fields. This cross-scale pattern recognition informed his approach to both theoretical and practical problems, allowing him to test principles on manageable scales while envisioning their application at much larger magnitudes. Beyond specific applications, this perspective reflected his broader understanding that reality operates through nested similarities, through principles that remain consistent whether expressed in the very small or the very large. In his private writings, Tesla occasionally reflected on what he termed the architecture of change, the patterns through which transformations occur not just in electrical systems, but in natural processes and human developments. He noted that significant shifts rarely happen through constant gradual alteration, but typically through periods of apparent stability, punctuated by moments of rapid reorganization. This observation, applied to both physical systems and the trajectory of discovery itself, informed his patient approach to innovation, his willingness to engage in long preparation with awareness that breakthrough would likely come not through steady progress, but through sudden reconfiguration after sufficient elements had aligned. This understanding of change as non-linear but patterned created in him unusual comfort, with apparent plateaus in development, with the quiet periods that precede significant transformation. As Tesla wandered through Manhattan parks in the early morning hours, he often paused to observe the behavior of pigeons, not merely as distraction, but as model systems. The way these birds communicated through subtle movements, organized without centralized control, and navigated using Earth's magnetic field, fascinated him. In these simple creatures, he perceived principles relevant to his own work, natural examples of distributed networks, of communication without wires, of orientation through invisible fields. This attention to biological systems as technological templates reflected his broader understanding that human innovation succeeds most profoundly not when imposing entirely novel frameworks, but when identifying and amplifying patterns already expressed in living systems. Throughout the evolution of his thinking, Tesla maintained an unusual relationship with what might be called the architecture of absence. His most significant innovations, wireless transmission, remote control, rotating magnetic fields, all involved engaging with unseen spaces, with the pregnant potentiality of apparent emptiness. While others focused primarily on tangible mechanisms, Tesla consistently attended to the field itself, to the medium through which effects propagated. This orientation toward absence as fertile ground, rather than mere void, reflected his deeper intuition that reality's most significant aspects often hide within what conventional perception dismisses as nothing, that emptiness itself contains structural properties awaiting recognition and activation through properly attuned interaction. The relationship between individual consciousness and collective knowledge featured prominently in Tesla's private reflections. He described occasionally experiencing moments of insight that seemed to arrive not from personal reasoning, but from connection to something larger, as if temporarily accessing a reservoir of understanding beyond individual generation. These experiences, which he discussed rarely and carefully, informed his perspective on innovation as discovery rather than creation, a perspective that understood human consciousness not as originating knowledge, but as receiving it through momentary alignments with patterns already present within nature's architecture. This view positioned the inventor not as heroic generator, but as attentive translator, someone whose primary gift lay in receptivity to what already exists, rather than capacity to impose entirely novel structures. During his walks through New York City, Tesla developed a practice he called urban observation, attending carefully to the rhythmic patterns underlying metropolitan life. He noted the oscillations in pedestrian density, the cyclic nature of traffic flow, the wave-like propagation of information through clustered conversations. These observations connected directly to his technical work, informing his understanding of how pulses move through networks, how congestion occurs at nodes, how signal and noise interact in complex systems. This integration of social observation with technical development reflected his broader practice of finding relevant patterns across traditionally separated domains, recognizing that principles manifesting in human communities might illuminate similar dynamics in electrical networks. Tesla's relationship with water extended beyond practical consideration to philosophical contemplation. Having grown up near flowing rivers and later worked extensively with hydroelectric systems, he developed deep appreciation for water as both metaphor and model for his electrical theories. The way currents moved through liquid, dividing around obstacles, converging beyond them, maintaining overall direction while adapting to local conditions, provided visual representation of how he understood electrical flow. This connection between visible fluid dynamics and invisible electromagnetic movement created conceptual bridges that informed both his theoretical understanding and his explanatory language. Throughout his writings, hydraulic metaphors appear not as simplifications, but as recognition of pattern similarities across different manifestations of natural flow. Throughout his career, Tesla maintained awareness of what he termed the breathing quality of effective systems, the necessity for technologies to incorporate cycles of activity and recovery, expansion and contraction, rather than maintaining constant states. This perspective informed his preference for alternating rather than direct current, his development of oscillating circuits, and his later interest in pulsed power transmission. Beyond specific applications, this recognition of rhythm as essential, rather than incidental, reflected his broader understanding that sustainability in any system, technical, biological, or social, requires incorporated periodicity, requires designed cycles that mirror the natural alternations observed throughout living systems, from cellular respiration to seasonal change. The concept of environmental responsiveness influenced Tesla's approach to both design and explanation. Unlike inventors who created systems intended to operate identically regardless of context, he often incorporated adaptive elements, components, that would shift their functioning in response to surrounding conditions. This approach emerged from his observation that natural systems thrive not through rigid maintenance of internal states, but through intelligent adaptation to changing external conditions. Applied to technology, this perspective generated innovations that could sense and respond to their environments rather than simply executing fixed instructions regardless of context. This quality of responsive adaptation, of technological sensitivity, reflected his broader vision of harmony between human creation and natural pattern. During periods of deep contemplation, Tesla occasionally described experiencing what he called the simultaneity effect, moments when causality itself seemed to shift from linear progression to networked interaction. In these states, which typically occurred during breakthrough insights, events no longer appeared to follow each other in strict sequence, but instead seemed to arise together from shared patterns, with cause and effect emerging as aspects of unified processes rather than separate stages. While maintaining scientific rigor in his formal work, these experiences informed his intuitive understanding of natural systems as inherently interconnected rather than mechanistically sequential. This perspective, rarely discussed publicly but evident in his holistic approach to innovation, positioned him conceptually ahead of the more reductive scientific frameworks common in his era. Throughout his life, Tesla developed increasingly refined awareness of what he called the signature quality in various phenomena, the distinctive patterns that identified particular types of energy, materials, or processes. Beyond obvious differences, he cultivated sensitivity to subtle variations in electrical discharge, in material resonance, in electromagnetic propagation, allowing him to recognize specific patterns where others perceived only generic categories. This attention to signature qualities, to the unique fingerprints of different phenomena, enabled him to distinguish between seemingly similar effects and to identify hidden relationships between apparently different processes. This perceptual refinement reflected his broader practice of attending not just to general principles, but to the specific expressions through which those principles manifest in particular contexts. In his later years, Tesla contemplated what he termed the threshold question, the inquiry into how and why certain systems transition suddenly from one state to another at specific energetic boundaries. This interest emerged from his observations of both electrical and biological systems, noting how current would suddenly arc across a gap when potential reached certain levels, how water would transform phase at precise temperature points, how living systems would reorganize in response to specific thresholds of stimulus. Beyond technical application, this inquiry reflected his philosophical interest in the nature of transformation itself, in understanding the precise conditions under which gradual change gives way to fundamental reorganization. This contemplation of thresholds as critical transition points informed both his technical innovations and his broader understanding of how change propagates through natural and human systems. The relationship between simplicity and complexity fascinated Tesla throughout his life. Having observed how remarkably simple principles could generate extraordinarily complex effects when allowed to interact over time, he developed appreciation for what might be called generative minimalism, the capacity of elegantly simple initial conditions to unfold into intricate patterns through natural development. This perspective informed his approach to both design and explanation, seeking not comprehensive specification of every detail, but identification of the essential patterns that would naturally evolve into desired complexity through their own inherent properties. Rather than controlling all aspects of a system through elaborate mechanisms, he increasingly sought to identify and amplify the fundamental patterns that would grow into complex behaviors through their own developmental logic. Creative dimensions, the I. Aesthetics of technology remained central to Tesla's approach throughout his career. Unlike many engineers who attended primarily to function, he maintained deep awareness of how the formal qualities of technical designs, their proportions, symmetries, and rhythmic elements, contributed to their effectiveness. This attention to beauty was not separate from practical concern, but integral to it, reflecting his understanding that elegant form often correlates with optimal function. In his laboratory, components were arranged not just for accessibility, but for proper relationship, with careful attention to spacing, alignment, and visual balance. This integration of aesthetic and technical sensibilities reflected his broader recognition that beauty itself might be understood not as subjective overlay, but as the visible manifestation of underlying harmony, a signal that essential relationships had been properly perceived and expressed. Throughout his creative practice, Tesla maintained unusual relationship with what might be called conditional thinking, the ability to hold multiple possible realities simultaneously in mind while exploring their respective implications. Rather than proceeding linearly from hypothesis through testing to conclusion, he would often develop several parallel conceptual frameworks for the same phenomenon, exploring how different fundamental assumptions would generate different explanatory systems and practical applications. This cognitive flexibility allowed him to shift perspective when conventional approaches reached limitations, to recognize when a problem's apparent difficulty stemmed not from inherent complexity, but from restrictive framing. This practice of conditional exploration reflected his deeper understanding that what we perceive as objective reality often depends significantly on our initial conceptual commitments. Tesla's notebooks contain frequent references to what he called the observer effect in creativity, his recognition that continued attention itself transforms what is observed, not just perceptually, but practically. He noted that the way he engaged with problems affected their development. That sustained contemplation of specific aspects gradually rendered those elements more manipulable, more amenable to reconfiguration. This effect, which he distinguished from mere subjective projection, informed his practice of intentional attention, of deliberately focusing on particular system elements, not just to understand them, but to render them more plastic, more responsive to inventive recombination. This awareness of observation as active rather than passive influence reflected his broader understanding of consciousness as participatory rather than merely receptive in its relationship with technological development. The creative tension between precision and ambiguity featured prominently in Tesla's approach to both conception and communication. While emphasizing mathematical exactitude in his formal work, he simultaneously cultivated comfort with productive uncertainty, with allowing ideas to remain partially formed during development rather than prematurely resolving them into fixed structures. His notebooks frequently contain deliberate spaces, open questions, and conditional pathways, reflections of his recognition that premature precision often closes generative possibilities. This balanced relationship with uncertainty, this willingness to maintain conceptual openness alongside rigorous specification, reflected his deeper understanding that innovation emerges most readily at the boundary between the known and the unknown, at the creative edge where structure meets possibility. Throughout his inventive process, Tesla developed increasingly refined awareness of what he called the characteristic resistance of different problems, their specific types of conceptual friction, their particular forms of developmental challenge. Beyond recognizing mere difficulty, he cultivated sensitivity to the qualitative nature of various obstacles, distinguishing between issues of technical implementation, conceptual framing, material limitation, or perceptual bias. This differentiated diagnosis allowed him to apply appropriate methodologies to different types of challenges, rather than approaching all problems through standardized frameworks. This nuanced relationship with difficulty, this recognition that obstacles differ not just in magnitude, but in essential character, reflected his broader practice of engaging with specific qualities rather than generic categories throughout his creative work. The role of incubation periods figured prominently in Tesla's creative process. Unlike inventors who approach problems through continuous active engagement, he deliberately incorporated intervals of apparent inactivity, times when he would set aside conscious work on particular challenges and allow his unconscious processes to continue development without directed intervention. These periods, which he carefully distinguished from mere rest or distraction, reflected his recognition that certain types of conceptual integration occur most effectively below the threshold of conscious awareness, that some relationships reveal themselves only when directly attention shifts elsewhere. This incorporation of strategic absence into his creative methodology reflected his broader understanding that innovation involves not just active generation, but receptive integration, not just doing, but allowing. Tesla maintained an unusual relationship with what might be called the materiality of ideas, experiencing concepts not as abstract entities, but as having specific textures, weights, and behaviors. He described certain theoretical frameworks as possessing distinctive qualities, some feeling brittle, others elastic, some heavy with implication, others light with potential, some resistant to manipulation, others readily malleable. This sensory engagement with conceptual material informed his selection of which ideas to develop further, which theoretical pathways to explore more deeply. Beyond conventional evaluation of logical coherence or empirical support, this attention to the felt qualities of ideas themselves created additional channels of discernment, ways of recognizing promising directions through their distinctive, conceptual textures rather than through analytical assessment alone. Throughout his creative life, Tesla developed increasingly refined awareness of what he called the proper moment, the recognition that timing itself significantly affects the development and reception of innovation. Beyond understanding general principles, he cultivated sensitivity to the specific readiness of various elements, technical components, theoretical frameworks, social contexts, observing that the same concept might fail in one temporal context, yet flourish in another, not because of inherent validity but because of coordinative alignment with surrounding conditions. This attention to kairos, rather than merely chronos, to qualitative timing rather than just quantitative time, informed his decisions about when to introduce particular ideas, when to pursue specific developments, when to allow certain concepts to mature further before attempting implementation. The integration of conscious and unconscious processes remained central to Tesla's creative methodology. Unlike inventors who relied primarily on directed reasoning, he deliberately developed practices that engaged both analytical and intuitive faculties, creating conditions where logical progression and spontaneous insight could mutually inform each other. His famous walking practices, his engagement with music and poetry, his careful attention to the hypnagogic state between wakefulness and sleep, all reflected his understanding that innovation emerges most powerfully when different modes of cognition collaborate, rather than when any single approach dominates. This integrative relationship with his own mental processes, this cultivation of complementary rather than competitive cognitive modalities, reflected his broader recognition that wholeness rather than partiality generates the most enduring discoveries. During conversations about the creative process, Tesla occasionally referenced what he called the migration effect in conceptual development, his observation that ideas themselves seem to possess certain nomadic qualities, moving through consciousness according to patterns not entirely determined by conscious direction. He noted that concepts would sometimes depart from active attention only to return later in modified form, having apparently undergone development during their absence. These experiences informed his patience with creative evolution, his willingness to allow ideas time for independent growth, rather than forcing their immediate development through concentrated effort. This perception of concepts as semi-autonomous entities with their own developmental trajectories reflected his broader sensitivity to the ways innovation involves collaboration with, rather than control of the creative process itself. Tesla's approach to creative obstacles differed significantly from conventional problem-solving methodologies. Rather than confronting difficulties directly through intensified effort, he often practiced what he called intentional circumvention, temporarily shifting attention to parallel challenges, alternative frameworks, or seemingly unrelated questions. These lateral movements, which might appear to others as distractions, reflected his understanding that certain problems resolve most effectively through indirect approach, that solutions sometimes emerge more readily through contextual reconfiguration than through direct assault. This oblique relationship with difficulty, this recognition that the path toward resolution sometimes requires temporary departure from the problem itself, reflected his broader practice of working with rather than against the natural patterns of conceptual development. In the contemplative moments between active work periods, Tesla would often engage in what he termed possibility scanning, a deliberate practice of considering unlikely or seemingly improbable configurations of the elements he was studying. Unlike conventional brainstorming, which typically remains tethered to established possibilities, this practice involved deliberate exploration of improbable territories, of combinations that conventional wisdom would dismiss as unworkable. This willful suspension of practical constraint, this temporary liberation from the boundary of the likely, created conceptual space for genuinely novel connections to form, connections that might later be refined into viable approaches but that would never have emerged within more restricted thinking. This relationship with the improbable, as potentially significant rather than merely distracting, reflected his broader appreciation for the creative value of temporarily transcending conventional boundaries throughout his inventive process. Tesla developed increasingly nuanced awareness of what he called the internal architecture of his creative states, the specific cognitive, emotional, and physiological configurations that accompany different phases of his inventive process. Beyond recognizing general mental conditions, he cultivated sensitivity to the particular quality of attention, the distinctive emotional atmosphere, and the specific bodily sensations associated with different types of creative work, from initial exploration to detailed implementation, from conceptual integration to practical refinement. This self-attunement informed his deliberate cultivation of internal conditions appropriate for different aspects of his work, creating optimal inner environments for the specific requirements of various developmental phases. This differentiated, rather than generic approach to creative states, reflected his broader understanding that different processes require different inner ecologies, different qualitative atmospheres to reach their fullest expression. Throughout his creative practice, Tesla maintained awareness of what he termed conceptual acoustics, the ways ideas resonated with each other across apparently separate domains. Beyond logical connection, he attended to how concepts from different fields created harmonic relationships, amplifications, and interference patterns when brought into proximity. This attention to cross-domain resonance informed his integrative approach to knowledge, finding relationships not through explicit similarity, but through shared underlying patterns, through common architectural principles manifesting in different contexts. This perception of knowledge as an interconnected field, rather than as isolated domains, reflected his broader understanding that reality itself operates through integrated rather than segregated patterns, that the apparent boundaries between disciplines reflect human categorical convenience, rather than inherent separation within natural phenomena. The relationship between constraint and freedom featured prominently in Tesla's creative methodology. Having recognized that innovation emerges most readily not from absolute openness, nor from rigid restriction, but from the creative tension between boundary and possibility, he developed what he called structured exploration, approaches that combined clear parametric limits with genuine freedom within those parameters. Unlike completely unconstrained ideation, which he found often produced diffuse rather than focused creativity, or overly restrictive frameworks which prevented novel emergence, this balanced approach created optimal conditions for directed yet genuinely innovative thinking. This complementary relationship between limitation and liberty, between defining boundaries and creating space for movement within them, reflected his broader understanding that creativity itself emerges most powerfully at the intersection of structure and openness throughout natural and human systems. Tesla maintained unusual awareness of what he termed the generative pause in creative development, the productive potential of temporarily suspending direct engagement with particular problems. Unlike inventors who approach challenges through continuous pursuit, he deliberately incorporated intervals of apparent inactivity, periods when he would withdraw direct attention from specific questions while maintaining background awareness of their essential elements. These structured absences, which he carefully distinguished from mere distraction or disengagement, reflected his recognition that certain types of conceptual reconfiguration occur most effectively when conscious direction temporarily relaxes, that solutions sometimes emerge not through intensified focus, but through strategic release. This incorporation of rhythmic withdrawal into his creative methodology reflected his broader understanding that development in any complex system requires alternation between engagement and disengagement, between directed emphasis and receptive openness. Throughout his inventive career, Tesla developed increasingly refined relationship with what he called the scale of abstraction, the various levels at which problems could be conceptualized and addressed. Beyond remaining fixed at particular conceptual altitudes, he cultivated the ability to move fluidly between different degrees of abstraction, from high-level theoretical frameworks to detailed technical specifications, from broad architectural principles to specific implementation requirements. This vertical mobility allowed him to recognize when solutions required shifting levels, when progress depended not on continued effort at the current conceptual altitude, but on temporary ascent to more general principles or descent to more specific manifestations. This flexible relationship with abstractive level, this refusal to remain fixed at particular conceptual heights, reflected his broader practice of appropriate rather than arbitrary positioning throughout his creative methodology. His recognition that different questions require different perspectives, different conceptual altitudes to reveal their essential patterns. The concept of generative friction played an essential role in Tesla's approach to innovation. Having observed how certain types of resistance catalyzed rather than merely impeded creative development, he cultivated what he called productive obstacles, deliberately introducing specific constraints or challenges that would force conceptual reconfiguration rather than merely allowing smooth but conventional progress. Unlike arbitrary difficulties, which he recognized as merely depleting, these carefully selected resistances created conditions that required genuine innovation that demanded stepping beyond established patterns into new configurational territories. This strategic relationship with difficulty, this recognition of certain forms of resistance as potentially catalytic rather than merely obstructive, reflected his broader understanding that development in complex systems often requires destabilization of existing patterns to enable emergence of new organizational principles. Tesla maintained unusual sensitivity to what he called the mood of thinking, the emotional atmosphere surrounding different cognitive activities. Beyond attending to logical content, he cultivated awareness of the qualitative feeling tones associated with different types of mental engagement, recognizing that certain emotional colorings facilitated particular forms of understanding while others created distortion or limitation. This attunement to cognitive effect informed his deliberate cultivation of specific emotional environments for different aspects of his work, creating internal conditions of curiosity for exploration, precision for implementation, receptivity for integration, persistence for refinement. This attention to the feeling quality of thought, to the way emotional atmosphere shapes cognitive process, reflected his broader understanding of cognition as inherently effective rather than purely rational activity. His recognition that how we feel significantly influences what and how we think, not as interference, but as essential component of the thinking process itself, adaptive intelligence. Throughout his life, Tesla demonstrated what modern psychologists might call exceptional cognitive flexibility, the capacity to shift rapidly between different mental frameworks as circumstances required. Unlike thinkers, who developed single consistent approaches, he cultivated multiple parallel cognitive systems, different ways of organizing perception and understanding that could be engaged according to the specific demands of various situations. This mental adaptability allowed him to recognize when particular frameworks had reached limitations and to transition toward more appropriate models without excessive attachment to established patterns. This fluid relationship with conceptual structures, this willingness to hold models provisionally rather than definitively, reflected his deeper understanding that maps serve travelers rather than territories, that conceptual frameworks exist to facilitate understanding rather than to capture final truth. The integration of analytical and intuitive cognition remained central to Tesla's approach throughout his career. Unlike researchers who relied primarily on either logical reasoning or instinctive judgment, he developed increasingly refined coordination between these complementary faculties, creating decision processes that incorporated both systematic evaluation and holistic assessment, both sequential analysis and immediate pattern recognition. This cognitive integration allowed simultaneous engagement with both measurable parameters and qualitative characteristics, with both explicit data and implicit understanding. This complementary relationship between different ways of knowing reflected his broader appreciation for multiple truth channels throughout his investigative methodology, his recognition that comprehensive understanding requires engagement with both the quantifiable and qualitative dimensions of reality rather than reduction to either aspect alone. Tesla maintained unusual awareness of what he called cognitive seasons, the natural cycles of different mental capabilities throughout various time frames. Beyond attempting to maintain constant output, he attended to the characteristic rhythms of his different cognitive faculties, recognizing that visual thinking, analytical reasoning, creative association, and other mental processes each had periods of greater and lesser availability throughout daily, monthly, and even yearly cycles. This attunement to internal timing informed his alignment of different types of work with their optimal cognitive seasons, scheduling activities requiring specific mental faculties during periods when those faculties naturally predominated rather than forcing consistent application regardless of internal conditions. This harmonious rather than dominative relationship with cognitive rhythms reflected his broader practice of working with rather than against natural patterns throughout his approach to both mental and physical systems. The concept of appropriate mental distance featured prominently in Tesla's approach to problem solving. Having recognized that different types of challenges required different degrees of psychological proximity, he cultivated what he called perspective mobility, the ability to shift fluidly between immersive engagement and detached observation, between intimate familiarity and fresh distance. This flexibility allowed him to recognize when solutions required changing vantage points, when progress depended not on continued effort from the current position, but on temporary movement toward greater intimacy or greater remove. This adaptive relationship with conceptual distance reflected his broader understanding that perception itself is substantially determined by position, that what becomes visible from one vantage point remains invisible from others regardless of observational intensity. Throughout his intellectual development, Tesla demonstrated increasingly refined metacognitive awareness, the capacity to observe his own thinking processes rather than merely engaging with their content. Beyond focusing exclusively on specific ideas, he cultivated what contemplative traditions sometimes call the witnessing position, an observational stance that allowed him to recognize patterns in his own cognitive tendencies, to notice when particular mental habits were creating limitation rather than illumination. This self-reflective capacity informed his ability to shift approaches when existing methods reached constraints, to adopt different cognitive strategies when familiar patterns proved inadequate for particular challenges. This relationship with thought as tool rather than identity reflected his broader understanding that conceptual models serve rather than define the consciousness that employs them. Tesla developed unusual capacity for what psychologists now term cognitive inhibition, the ability to temporarily suppress habitual responses in favor of less familiar but more appropriate approaches. Unlike thinkers who reflexively applied established methods regardless of their suitability for specific situations, he cultivated the discipline to withhold automatic application of familiar patterns when facing novel challenges, creating space for fresh perception unconstrained by previous solutions. This capacity for response suspension, for delaying immediate application of existing knowledge, allowed genuine innovation rather than mere refinement of established approaches. This relationship with cognitive habit as available resource rather than determining pattern reflected his broader practice of appropriate rather than automatic application throughout his problem-solving methodology. The integration of focused and defocused attention remained essential to Tesla's cognitive approach. Having recognized the complementary value of both concentrated and distributed awareness, he developed increasingly refined coordination between these different attentional modes, creating thinking processes that incorporated both precise examination of specific elements and receptive awareness of broader contextual relationships. Unlike approaches that emphasized either narrow focus or wide awareness exclusively, this attentional integration allowed simultaneous engagement with both particular details and their situational meanings, with both specific components and their systemic implications. This complementary relationship between different ways of attending reflected his broader appreciation for multiple perception channels throughout his observational practice, his recognition that comprehensive understanding requires engagement with both the specific and the contextual rather than reduction to either dimension alone. Throughout his intellectual life, Tesla maintained unusual relationship with what might be called the architecture of knowledge, the structural patterns through which information organizes itself within consciousness. Beyond content acquisition, he attended to the connective frameworks between different information domains, developing increasingly refined understanding of how various knowledge fields related to each other, not just through explicit reference, but through shared underlying patterns. This attention to knowledge organization informed his integrative approach to learning, finding relationships not through superficial similarity, but through common structural principles manifesting across different contexts. This perception of knowledge as interconnected network rather than isolated territories reflected his broader understanding that reality itself operates through integrated rather than segregated patterns, that the apparent boundaries between disciplines reflect human categorical convenience rather than inherent separation within natural phenomena. Tesla cultivated increasingly nuanced awareness of what he called cognitive textures, the qualitative differences between various types of understanding beyond their informational content. He recognized that knowledge itself possessed distinctive characteristics depending on how it was acquired, that understanding developed through direct experience differed significantly from knowledge gained through abstract concept, that information obtained through sustained immersion had different qualities than content acquired through brief exposure. This attention to qualitative aspects of knowing informed his approach to both learning and communication, creating educational pathways that provided not just appropriate information, but appropriate forms of engagement with that information based on its essential nature. This differentiated rather than generic approach to knowledge acquisition reflected his broader recognition that different types of understanding require different modes of engagement, rather than uniform processing, regardless of content type. The concept of cognitive momentum played an essential role in Tesla's approach to both learning and innovation. Having observed how established thinking patterns create directional tendencies that continue beyond their initial application, he developed what he called pattern interruption practices, deliberate techniques for disrupting habitual cognitive trajectories when they had reached the limits of their usefulness. Unlike thinkers who remained committed to particular approaches despite diminishing returns, he cultivated the capacity to recognize when existing momentum was leading toward limitation rather than insight, and to introduce specific disruptions that allowed reconfiguration of mental direction. This strategic relationship with cognitive habit, this recognition of thought patterns as both enabling and potentially constraining, reflected his broader understanding that development in any complex system requires periods of destabilization to enable emergence of new organizational principles. Throughout his investigative practice, Tesla maintained awareness of what he termed the emotional dimension of intelligence, the way affective qualities significantly influenced cognitive capabilities. Beyond treating emotion as separate, far more interfering with thought, he cultivated increasingly refined understanding of how different feeling states enabled different forms of mental engagement, how certain emotional atmospheres facilitated particular types of perception, analysis, and insight, while others created specific limitations or distortions. This attunement to cognitive effect informed his deliberate cultivation of appropriate emotional environments for different aspects of his work, creating internal conditions that harmonized with rather than opposed the essential requirements of various intellectual activities. This integrated rather than segregated approach to emotion and cognition reflected his broader recognition that intelligence itself operates as whole system function rather than as isolated rational faculty. Tesla developed increasingly sophisticated relationship with what might be called cognitive boundaries, the conceptual parameters that define the territory of consideration for particular problems. Unlike thinkers who accepted conventional problem definitions without examination, he cultivated the habit of explicitly identifying and questioning the assumed borders of challenges, recognizing when difficulties stemmed not from complexity within defined territories, but from the definitional boundaries themselves. This attention to frame as well as content allowed him to recognize when solutions required boundary reconfiguration rather than intensified effort within existing parameters, when progress depended not on working harder within established thinking perimeters, but on redrawing the conceptual map to include previously excluded elements or relationships. This reflexive awareness of cognitive framing, this capacity to perceive and modify the usually invisible boundaries of consideration, reflected his broader understanding that how we define problems substantially determines what solutions become available, that conceptual territories are constructed rather than discovered. The integration of verbal and non-verbal thinking remained central to Tesla's cognitive approach. Unlike thinkers who operated primarily through language-based reasoning, he cultivated multiple parallel representational systems, developing facilities with visual, spatial, mathematical, and linguistic modes of thought that could operate either independently or in coordinated fashion, depending on situational requirements. This multimodal cognition allowed simultaneous engagement with different aspects of complex phenomena through complementary processing channels, creating comprehensive understanding that transcended the limitations of any single representational system. This complementary relationship between different ways of mental modeling reflected his broader appreciation for multiple knowledge pathways throughout his investigative methodology, his recognition that reality itself presents different aspects through different perceptual and conceptual windows rather than conforming to any single representational framework. Throughout his intellectual development, Tesla demonstrated what modern cognitive science might term exceptional working memory capacity, the ability to maintain and manipulate multiple complex elements simultaneously within consciousness. Beyond simple information retention, he cultivated the capacity to hold elaborate systems in mind while making precise adjustments to specific components, mentally simulating the ripple effects of particular changes throughout interconnected networks before implementation. This cognitive spaciousness allowed comprehensive system thinking rather than merely sequential processing, creating understanding of how modifications to individual elements affected overall configurations rather than approaching problems through isolated adjustments without contextual awareness. This integrated rather than fragmented approach to complexity reflected his broader understanding that significant innovation emerges not through isolated changes, but through reconfiguration of relationship patterns within comprehensive systems. Tesla maintained unusual awareness of what he called conceptual metabolism, the processes through which new information and ideas were incorporated into existing cognitive structures. Beyond simple addition of content, he attended to the transformative interactions between established understanding and novel input, recognizing that significant learning involved not merely accumulation, but reorganization, not just acquisition, but integration that often modified both the new element and the receiving structure. This attention to assimilative dynamics informed his approach to both education and innovation, creating learning pathways that facilitated genuine incorporation rather than mere collection, that supported transformative rather than merely additive knowledge development. This relationship with learning as metabolic rather than mechanical process reflected his broader appreciation for organic rather than artificial models throughout his understanding of both mental and physical systems. His recognition that growth in living systems occurs through integrative transformation rather than through simple aggregation of separate components. Environmental awareness. Throughout his life, Tesla maintained complex awareness of what he called the conversational nature of environmental interaction, the way physical surroundings significantly influenced cognitive, emotional, and physiological patterns. Beyond treating setting as merely external, he cultivated sensitivity to the subtle dialogues between internal and external conditions, to the ways architectural spaces, natural landscapes, acoustic fields, and electromagnetic environments affected both conscious and unconscious aspects of experience. This attunement to contextual influence informed his careful selection and modification of working environments, creating surroundings that harmonized with rather than opposed his essential purposes. This relationship with setting as participatory rather than passive reflected his broader understanding that consciousness itself emerges through ongoing exchange between organism and environment, rather than existing as separate entity merely contained within physical location. The concept of appropriate sensory balance remained central to Tesla's approach to environmental design. Having recognized that different activities required different sensory emphasis, he developed increasingly refined understanding of how to create settings that privileged particular perceptual channels without completely excluding complementary inputs. Unlike environments that maximized or minimized stimulation across all sensing modalities regardless of function, his workspaces featured carefully calibrated sensory profiles, acoustic qualities, lighting conditions, spatial arrangements, and tactile elements specifically configured to support the essential requirements of particular activities. This differentiated rather than generic approach to environmental composition reflected his broader recognition that optimal function in any system requires contextual appropriateness rather than universal maximization or minimization regardless of purpose. Tesla developed increasingly nuanced awareness of what he termed environmental temperament, the distinctive qualitative characteristics of different settings beyond their measurable properties. Beyond quantifiable parameters like temperature, humidity, or illumination levels, he cultivated sensitivity to the more subtle atmospheric qualities of various locations, the particular feeling tones, the specific types of attention they facilitated, the distinctive cognitive and emotional states they tended to evoke. This attention to qualitative aspects of environment informed both his selection of existing settings and his modification of spaces under his control, creating surroundings whose temperamental characteristics harmonized with his intended activities. This differentiated rather than generic approach to context reflected his broader understanding that places, like materials and systems, possess characteristic signatures beyond their technical specifications, qualitative identities that significantly influence the experiences and processes they contain. Throughout his professional practice, Tesla maintained awareness of what he called threshold zones in environmental experience, the transitional territories between different types of settings whose characteristics significantly affected movement between various activities. Beyond attending to primary work areas, he recognized the importance of entry and exit spaces, of the gradual rather than abrupt shifts between different functional environments. This attention to transitional territories informed his design of gradual rather than sudden changes between spaces with different purposes, creating intermediate zones that allowed physiological, emotional, and cognitive adjustment rather than jarring relocation. This appreciation for threshold management reflected his broader understanding of transition rather than merely state throughout natural systems. His recognition that how change occurs often matters as much as the specific conditions being changed between. The integration of natural and technological elements remained essential to Tesla's environmental approach. Having recognized the complementary values of both organic and mechanical components, he developed increasingly refined coordination between these different systemic types, creating settings that incorporated both natural patterns and technological amplifications, both biological rhythms and engineered extensions. Unlike environments that emphasized either natural or artificial elements exclusively, his preferred surroundings featured deliberate conversation between these different orders, allowing each to complement rather than replace the other. This balanced relationship between nature and technology reflected his broader appreciation for integration rather than opposition throughout his understanding of human relationship with the larger world. His recognition that sustainable innovation emerges through alignment rather than conquest, through partnership rather than domination. Tesla maintained unusual sensitivity to what he termed the field quality of different environments, the invisible but influential energetic characteristics that permeated particular settings. Beyond observable features, he attended to the electromagnetic, acoustic, and subtle atmospheric conditions that created distinctive experiential envelopes within different locations. This attention to field properties informed both his selection of working environments and his modification of spaces under his control, creating surroundings whose invisible qualities supported rather than interfered with his intended activities. This relationship with the unseen dimensions of environment reflected his broader understanding that physical settings consist not merely of solid elements, but of interpenetrating fields whose properties significantly influence the processes occurring within them, that spaces are defined as much by their energetic signatures as by their material boundaries. Throughout his environmental adaptation, Tesla developed increasingly refined awareness of what he called appropriate scale, the recognition that different activities required not just different types of settings, but different dimensional relationships. Beyond simple size considerations, he cultivated sensitivity to the proper proportional qualities for different functions, noting that certain processes operated optimally in spaces of specific scale, neither larger nor smaller. This attention to inherent rather than arbitrary sizing informed his approach to both laboratory design and personal accommodation, creating environments whose dimensional characteristics emerged from functional essence rather than external considerations. This recognition of intrinsic rather than imposed scaling reflected his broader understanding that natural systems operate according to inherent proportional harmonies rather than arbitrary dimensional assignments, that optimal function emerges when spatial containers properly match the essential requirements of the processes they house. The concept of environmental rhythm played an essential role in Tesla's approach to context management. Having observed how natural settings incorporated cyclic rather than constant patterns of light, sound, temperature, and activity, he developed increasingly sophisticated understanding of how to create surroundings that reflected these natural oscillations rather than maintaining artificial steadiness. Unlike environments that emphasized uniform conditions regardless of time, his preferred settings featured deliberate rhythmic variations, cycles of intensity and relaxation, of emphasis and withdrawal that mirrored the natural oscillations observed throughout living systems. This attendance to contextual rhythm rather than stasis reflected his broader appreciation for cyclic rather than linear patterns throughout his understanding of sustainable function. His recognition that all living processes incorporate periods of engagement and recovery, of concentration and dispersion, rather than maintaining constant states regardless of natural tendency. Tesla maintained unusual awareness of what he termed nested environments, the way settings existed within larger contexts that significantly influenced their internal characteristics. Beyond treating spaces as isolated containers, he cultivated sensitivity to how surrounding conditions filtered into and modified supposedly separate environments, how urban atmospheric quality affected indoor air composition, how regional electromagnetic fields penetrated building boundaries, how geological formations influenced subtle vibrations within structures built upon them. This attention to contextual hierarchy informed his holistic approach to environmental selection and modification, addressing not just immediate surroundings, but their relationship with larger containing systems. This perception of embedded, rather than isolated contexts reflected his broader understanding that all apparently separate entities exist within interconnected fields that substantially influence their internal conditions, that boundaries serve as permeable interfaces rather than absolute divisions between inside and outside. Throughout his environmental practice, Tesla demonstrated increasingly refined relationship with what might be called contextual counterpoint, the deliberate integration of complementary rather than identical elements within cohesive settings. Unlike surroundings based on uniformity, his preferred environments incorporated intentional contrasts, precise instrumentation alongside natural materials, mathematical precision alongside organic variability, technological sophistication alongside elemental simplicity. This compositional approach created settings characterized by dynamic balance rather than monotonous consistency, by harmonious juxtaposition rather than mere repetition of similar components. This appreciation for integrated diversity reflected his broader understanding that sustainable systems incorporate complementary rather than identical elements, that resilience emerges through differentiated collaboration rather than through replication of uniform parts, regardless of function. Deliberately developed practices that engaged both analytical and intuitive faculties, creating conditions where logical progression and spontaneous insight could mutually inform each other. His famous walking practices, his engagement with music and poetry, his careful attention to the hypnagogic state between wakefulness and sleep, all reflected his understanding that innovation emerges most powerfully when different modes of cognition collaborate, rather than when any single approach dominates. This integrative relationship with his own mental processes, this cultivation of complementary rather than competitive cognitive modalities, reflected his broader recognition that wholeness rather than partiality generates the most enduring discoveries. During conversations about the creative process, Tesla occasionally referenced what he called the migration effect in conceptual development. His observation that ideas themselves seem to possess certain nomadic qualities, moving through consciousness according to patterns not entirely determined by conscious direction. He noted that concepts would sometimes depart from active attention only to return later in modified form, having apparently undergone development during their absence. These experiences informed his patience with creative evolution, his willingness to allow ideas time for independent growth rather than forcing their immediate development through concentrated effort. This perception of concepts as semi-autonomous entities with their own developmental trajectories reflected his broader sensitivity to the ways innovation involves collaboration with rather than control of the creative process itself. Tesla's approach to creative obstacles differed significantly from conventional problem-solving methodologies. Rather than confronting difficulties directly through intensified effort, He often practiced what he called intentional circumvention, temporarily shifting attention to parallel challenges, alternative frameworks, or seemingly unrelated questions. These lateral movements, which might appear to others as distractions, reflected his understanding that certain problems resolve most effectively through indirect approach, that solutions sometimes emerge more readily through contextual reconfiguration than through direct assault. This oblique relationship with difficulty, this recognition that the path toward resolution sometimes requires temporary departure from the problem itself, reflected his broader practice of working with, rather than against, the natural patterns of conceptual development. Mindful attention. In contemplative moments, Tesla often reflected on what he called the transparency effect in perception, the tendency of familiar patterns to become increasingly invisible through continued exposure. Having observed how daily contact gradually rendered even remarkable phenomena unremarkable, he developed practices specifically designed to refresh perception, to encounter known realities with renewed attention. These practices included observing common objects from unusual angles, examining familiar processes at altered speeds, and deliberately questioning habitual interpretations of routine experiences. This cultivation of perceptual renewal, of sustained sensitivity to the extraordinary within the ordinary, reflected his broader understanding that innovation depends not just on encountering new phenomena, but on seeing familiar patterns with fresh awareness. Throughout his daily activities, Tesla practiced what he called calibrated noticing, the deliberate adjustment of attention to different perceptual scales. Rather than maintaining fixed focus, he would intentionally shift between broad contextual awareness and precise detail recognition, between pattern perception and specific instance observation. This flexibility of attentional scale allowed him to identify relationships between phenomena that appeared unconnected when observed from single perspectives, revealing complementary patterns that became visible only through deliberate shifts in perceptual framing. This practice of variable focus, of intentional movement between different attentional apertures, reflected his broader understanding that comprehensive perception requires multiple modes of seeing rather than refinement of any single observational approach. Tesla developed increasingly nuanced awareness of what he called the mood of materials, the way specific substances seem to possess not just physical properties, but characteristic temperaments. Beyond technical understanding of conductivity, tensile strength or thermal properties, he cultivated sensitivity to how different materials responded to manipulation, noting that some accepted modification readily, while others exhibited what he called dignified resistance. This attentiveness to qualitative aspects of physical substances informed his selection of components, his design of experimental apparatus, and his communication with fabrication specialists. Beyond conventional specification, he would often describe the proper feeling of interaction with particular materials, guidance that skilled craftsmen recognized as containing essential wisdom despite its apparent subjectivity. The concept of attentional rhythm remained central to Tesla's observational practice. Having noticed that perception itself seemed to operate through patterns of engagement and release, focus and relaxation, he developed what he called pulsed attention, a deliberate alternation between concentrated observation and receptive awareness. Rather than maintaining continuous intensity, which he found diminished perceptual sensitivity over time, he cultivated rhythmic cycles that allowed full engagement without depletion. This oscillatory approach to observation, this recognition that attention itself functions optimally through alternation rather than sustainment, reflected his broader understanding that rhythmic rather than constant processes generate the most effective and sustainable outcomes across natural systems. Throughout his explorations, Tesla maintained unusual awareness of what he termed the negative space in perception, the importance of attending not just to what is present, but to what is absent, not just to what occurs, but to what does not occur. Beyond observing effects, he cultivated sensitivity to non-events, to the pregnant implications of what failed to happen when conventional understanding would predict occurrence. This attention to absence as information rather than mere emptiness allowed him to recognize significant patterns, that remained invisible to those focused exclusively on positive occurrences. This appreciation for the informativeness of the non-manifest, for the significance of the gap, the silence, the void, reflected his broader recognition that reality emerges through the interplay of presence and absence, rather than through presence alone. Tesla's observational practice included what he called temporal expansion, the deliberate slowing of perception to reveal transitional states typically lost to awareness. By cultivating attention to the intervals between apparent conditions, to the developmental stages between recognized states, he gained access to phenomenological territories that remained invisible during conventional observation. This dilated perception revealed that what appeared as sudden transitions when viewed normally actually contained complex intermediate processes when examined through expanded temporal awareness. This attention to the between, to the usually invisible transformations connecting visible conditions, reflected his broader sensitivity to continuity underlying apparent discreteness throughout natural systems. The integration of focused and peripheral awareness remained essential to Tesla's perceptual approach. Unlike observers who concentrated exclusively on central targets of attention, he maintained what he called inclusive perception, simultaneous engagement with both specific focal points and their surrounding contexts. This stereoscopic attention allowed him to recognize how particular phenomena were modified by their environmental relationships, how seemingly isolated effects actually existed within complex interactive fields. Beyond seeing objects or events as independent entities, he perceived them as participants in broader systems, their properties emerging not just from inherent characteristics, but from ongoing contextual exchanges. This relational rather than isolated perception reflected his broader understanding that reality consists not of separate elements, but of dynamic interactive networks. Throughout his experimental work, Tesla developed increasingly refined understanding of what he called the observer's contribution, the ways observation itself introduces specific energies and patterns into what is being observed. Beyond recognizing measurement effects in precise instrumentation, he cultivated awareness of how his own physiological rhythms, cognitive frameworks, and even emotional states subtly influenced experimental outcomes. Rather than attempting to eliminate these contributions, which he considered impossible, he developed methodologies that accounted for them, creating consistent observational protocols that made these effects regular rather than random. This integration of observer into observation, this recognition of participation rather than pretense of pure objectivity, reflected his broader understanding of scientific practice as embodied rather than disembodied engagement with natural phenomena. In his private contemplative practice, Tesla occasionally referenced what he called coherence perception, momentary experiences of directly apprehending the underlying patterns connecting apparently disparate phenomena. Beyond analytical recognition of similarities, these were integrative experiences wherein relationships themselves became directly perceptible rather than conceptually constructed. These unusual states of awareness, which typically occurred during periods of relaxed attention rather than concentrated effort, informed his approach to innovation. His understanding that certain insights arrive not through accumulation of information, but through spontaneous recognition of inherent order. This appreciation for direct pattern recognition, for moments when relationships reveal themselves rather than being laboriously assembled, reflected his broader valuing of multiple modes of knowing beyond conventional analytical understanding. The balance between expectation and openness remained central to Tesla's observational methodology. Having recognized how preconception often obscures perception, he developed what he called informed innocence, the capacity to combine knowledgeable prediction with genuine receptivity to unexpected outcomes. This integration allowed him to design experiments based on theoretical understanding while remaining fully attentive to unforeseen results, neither ignoring anomalies that contradicted expectation nor missing confirming evidence through lack of anticipatory framework. This complementary relationship between knowledge and curiosity, between informed prediction and authentic openness, reflected his broader understanding that discovery emerges most readily at the boundary where expectation meets experience, where the map encounters the territory. Relational dimensions. Throughout his life, Tesla maintained complex awareness of what he called the conversational nature of technological development, the way innovation emerges not through isolated invention, but through ongoing dialogue between human intention and material response. Beyond imposing predetermined designs, he approached creation as a form of respectful exchange, proposing configurations, observing reactions, modifying approaches based on how materials and forces replied to initial proposals. This relational, rather than dictatorial approach positioned the inventor not as sovereign creator, but as attentive partner, someone who succeeds not through domination, but through cultivated sensitivity to how reality responds to various invitations. This perspective of technology as conversation rather than conquest reflected his broader understanding that sustainable innovation emerges through alignment rather than imposition. The concept of mutual transformation remained central to Tesla's understanding of relationship between inventor and invention. Beyond creating tools that changed the world, he maintained awareness of how the process of creation simultaneously changed the creator, how working with electricity had gradually altered his own perceptual patterns, conceptual frameworks, and even physiological responses. This recognition of bidirectional influence, of invention as reciprocal rather than unidirectional process, informed his approach to innovation as developmental journey rather than merely productive activity. Beyond generating external results, he valued the internal evolutions catalyzed through engagement with natural forces, understanding technical exploration as simultaneously an exploration of consciousness itself. Tesla developed increasingly refined appreciation for what he called the temperament of systems, the distinctive behavioral tendencies of different technological arrangements beyond their formal specifications. Beyond designing according to quantitative parameters, he cultivated sensitivity to qualitative characteristics, noting that certain configurations, while technically adequate, exhibited what he described as reluctance or hesitation, while others displayed eagerness or fluidity in their operation. This attention to system personality, to the behavioral signatures of different arrangements, informed both his design refinements and his operational protocols, creating technologies that succeeded not just functionally, but temperamentally, demonstrating harmony between component relationships and intended applications. Throughout his professional relationships, Tesla maintained awareness of what he termed resonant collaboration, the particular quality that emerges when minds with complementary rather than identical patterns work together. Unlike partnerships, based on similarity, which he found often reinforced existing limitations, he valued engagements with individuals whose cognitive approaches differed from yet harmonized with his own. These collaborative resonances, which created generative interference patterns rather than mere amplification, allowed exploration of conceptual territories inaccessible to any single perceptual framework. This appreciation for cognitive complementarity, for the creative potential of harmonious difference, reflected his broader understanding that innovation emerges most readily at the boundaries between different ways of seeing rather than through intensification of any single perspective. The relationship between concentration and distribution featured prominently in Tesla's approach to energy systems. Having observed natural patterns of gathering and dissemination, of focus and dispersal, he developed technologies that reflected these complementary movements, creating systems that could both collect diffuse energies into concentrated forms and distribute concentrated power through extensive networks. Beyond technical implementation, this balance between gathering and giving informed his broader understanding of sustainable cycles, his recognition that effective systems maintain dynamic equilibrium between accumulation and disbursement rather than emphasizing either function exclusively. This complementary relationship between concentration and distribution reflected his larger appreciation for cyclic rather than linear processes throughout natural and human systems. Throughout his explorations of electrical phenomena, Tesla maintained awareness of what he called the request pattern in experimentation, the recognition that different approaches to investigation effectively asked different questions of natural systems and consequently received different responses. Beyond technical procedures, he attended to the implicit attitudes embedded within experimental designs, noting that apparatus constructed with certain intentions seemed to elicit corresponding patterns of result. This sensitivity to the philosophical, positions encoded within methodological choices, informed his approach to investigation as invitation rather than extraction, creating experimental contexts that allowed phenomena to reveal themselves according to their own inherent properties, rather than conform to pre-established expectations. Tesla developed increasingly nuanced understanding of what he termed appropriate scales in technological development, the recognition that different applications required not just different sizes, but different proportional relationships based on their inherent natures. Beyond simple enlargement or reduction, he cultivated sensitivity to the proper dimensional qualities for different functions, noting that certain processes operated optimally at specific scales, neither larger nor smaller. This attention to inherent rather than arbitrary sizing informed his approach to both experimental models and commercial implementations, creating technologies whose dimensions emerged from their functional essence rather than from external considerations. This recognition of intrinsic, rather than imposed scaling, reflected his broader understanding that natural systems operate according to inherent proportional harmonies rather than arbitrary dimensional assignments. The concept of transitional spaces remained central to Tesla's approach to both technical and social innovation. Having observed how natural processes typically incorporate gradual rather than abrupt transitions between different states or regions, he designed technologies that included what he called gradient zones, areas of mediated change rather than sharp boundaries. These transitional regions, which moderated otherwise jarring shifts between different conditions, reflected his broader appreciation for the importance of threshold management in sustainable systems. Beyond technical application, this attention to how change propagates through boundaries informed his understanding of how innovations integrate into social contexts, recognizing that effective adoption typically requires carefully designed transitions rather than sudden impositions. Throughout his career, Tesla maintained unusual awareness of what he called the signature resonance between specific individuals and particular types of work, the recognition that different people naturally harmonize with different aspects of any complex field. Beyond general aptitude, he cultivated sensitivity to these distinctive attunements, noting that certain minds naturally gravitated toward theoretical exploration while others flourished in experimental refinement. Some excelled with electrical principles, while others with mechanical implementation. This attention to individual resonance patterns informed his approach to both personal development and team composition, creating contexts where each person could engage primarily with aspects that activated their particular signature frequencies rather than conforming to standardized expectations. In his later reflections, Tesla occasionally referenced what he called the inheritance pattern in technological development, the way each innovation carries forward not just technical capabilities, but philosophical orientations from its developmental lineage. Beyond functional specifications, he attended to the conceptual DNA embedded within different approaches, recognizing that technologies descended from different ancestral designs often carried forward distinct relationships with efficiency, control, access, or sustainability. This awareness of technological genealogy, of the philosophical commitments encoded within technical evolution, informed his approach to innovation as not just functional advancement, but ethical continuation, each development representing not just what could be done, but what should be done based on its inherited wisdom. The balance between directedness and receptivity remained central to Tesla's creative methodology. Having recognized the complementary value of both intentional pursuit and open awareness, he developed what he called guided wandering, an approach that combined clear purpose with spacious attention. specific goals with genuine openness to unexpected discoveries. Unlike strictly linear processes, which he found often missed adjacent opportunities, this integration of intention and receptivity allowed simultaneous progress toward defined objectives and recognition of unanticipated possibilities. This balanced relationship with purpose, this ability to maintain direction without sacrificing openness, reflected his broader understanding that innovation emerges most powerfully when focus and flexibility collaborate rather than compete. Inner landscapes. The quality of Tesla's attention differed remarkably from conventional scientific observation. Beyond focused concentration, he cultivated what he called environmental awareness, a state wherein he remained simultaneously attentive to specific phenomena and receptive to their contextual relationships. This stereoscopic perception allowed him to recognize how electrical effects were modified by seemingly unrelated factors, atmospheric conditions, material proximities, even the subtle electromagnetic fields generated by human bodies in his laboratory. This integration of focal and peripheral awareness, this refusal to isolate phenomena from their contexts, reflected his broader understanding that reality consists not of separate objects, but of relationship fields within which apparent objects emerge as temporary concentrations. Throughout periods of intense work, Tesla maintained awareness of what he called the rhythm of insight, the natural alternation between active development and integrative rest. Unlike researchers who attempted to maintain constant productivity, he recognized distinct phases in the creative process, times for deliberate pursuit and times for receptive waiting, moments for analytical dissection and moments for holistic perception. Rather than forcing consistent output, he aligned his activities with these natural cognitive cycles, concentrating intensely when clarity was present, resting or engaging in complementary activities when direct progress slowed. This harmony with internal rhythm, this refusal to impose artificial consistency on naturally variable processes, reflected his broader appreciation for cyclic rather than constant patterns throughout natural systems. Tesla developed increasingly nuanced understanding of what he termed the qualitative texture of different mental states, the distinctive perceptual and conceptual characteristics of various modes of consciousness. Beyond recognizing mere differences between concentration and relaxation, he cultivated sensitivity to the specific attributes of different attentional conditions, noting that certain problems resolved most effectively in particular cognitive environments. This awareness of state-specific cognition informed his methodical cultivation of various consciousness qualities, developing practices that allowed him to enter the specific mental conditions most appropriate for different aspects of his work. This differentiated rather than generic approach to mental states reflected his broader recognition that consciousness itself possesses multiple modalities, each with particular sensing and processing capabilities. The integration of intellectual and somatic awareness remained essential to Tesla's approach. Unlike thinkers who operated primarily through abstract reasoning, he maintained what he called embodied cognition, processing information not just through conceptual analysis, but through physical sensation. Complex electrical relationships registered not only as mental models but as felt patterns, as bodily knowing. This integration of multiple knowledge channels allowed simultaneous engagement with both mathematical precision and qualitative experience, creating comprehensive understanding that transcended the limitations of purely analytical or purely intuitive approaches. This complementary relationship between different ways of knowing reflected his broader appreciation for integration rather than specialization throughout his perceptual and conceptual frameworks. Throughout his life, Tesla cultivated awareness of what he called the negative space in consciousness, the fertile emptiness between thoughts, the receptive intervals between analytical processes. Beyond valuing active cognition, he recognized the essential importance of mental silence, not as absence but as pregnant possibility, as the necessary ground from which new patterns could emerge. These spaces of apparent inactivity, which he deliberately incorporated into his working rhythm, created openings through which unexpected connections could form below the threshold of directed attention. This appreciation for cognitive emptiness, for the productivity of apparent absence, reflected his broader understanding that creation requires alternation between formation and dissolution, between presence and space. Tesla maintained unusual awareness of what he termed the architecture of memory, the structural patterns through which information organizes itself within consciousness. Beyond content recall, he attended to the connective relationships between remembered elements, noticing how certain memories naturally linked with others according to various associative principles. This attention to mnemonic patterning informed his development of specialized memory practices, creating organizational frameworks that aligned with rather than opposed the mind's natural tendencies toward certain types of connection. This collaborative rather than impositional relationship with remembrance reflected his broader approach to working with rather than against inherent tendencies in both mental and physical systems. In periods of deep focus, Tesla occasionally referenced what he called transparency experiences, moments when the usual boundary between observer and observed temporarily dissolved, when understanding occurred not through analysis of separate phenomena, but through direct participation in the patterns being studied. These states, which typically emerge during prolonged engagement with particular problems, allowed perception of relationships that remained invisible from more conventional observational positions. While maintaining scientific rigor in his formal work, these experiences informed his intuitive navigation of complex systems, enabling recognition of essential patterns without requiring exhaustive analysis of each component element. This complementary relationship between analytical distance and participatory knowing reflected his broader integration of multiple epistemological approaches throughout his research methodology. Throughout his experimental practice, Tesla developed increasingly refined awareness of what he called the mood of thinking, the emotional tonality that accompanied different cognitive processes. Beyond attending to logical content, he cultivated sensitivity to the qualitative atmosphere of various mental states, recognizing that certain emotional colorings facilitated particular types of understanding. This awareness of cognitive affect informed his deliberate cultivation of specific emotional environments for different aspects of his work, creating internal conditions of curiosity for exploration, of precision for implementation, of openness for integration. This attention to the feeling tone of thought, to the way emotional quality shapes intellectual process, reflected his broader understanding of cognition as full spectrum rather than narrowly rational activity. The relationship between verbalized and non-verbalized understanding remained central to Tesla's cognitive approach, having recognized that certain insights initially formed as pre-linguistic patterns, as spatial relationships, energetic dynamics, or mathematical harmonies prior to verbal formulation. He developed what he called translation practices to bridge between these different modes of knowing. Rather than forcing immediate articulation, he allowed understanding to develop first in its native form, whether as visual model, felt sense, or mathematical intuition, before carefully constructing linguistic representations that preserved essential qualities rather than reducing complexity to fit conventional expression. This respect for knowledge's indigenous forms, for understanding's original patterns prior to verbalization, reflected his broader appreciation for multiple representational systems throughout his communicative practice. The concept of perspective remained essential to Tesla's cognitive methodology. Beyond maintaining fixed viewpoints, he practiced what he called positional thinking, deliberately shifting between various conceptual locations to perceive problems from different angles. These perspective movements, which he applied both literally, physically moving around apparatus to observe from various positions, and figuratively, mentally adopting different theoretical frameworks, allowed recognition of aspects that remained invisible from any single viewpoint. This practice of intentional cognitive relocation, of systematic variation in observational position, reflected his broader understanding that comprehensive knowledge emerges not through intensification of any single perspective, but through integration of multiple partial views, each revealing aspects obscured from other positions. Sensory dimensions. Tesla's perceptual sensitivity extended far beyond conventional observation. Throughout his life, he maintained unusual awareness of subtle electromagnetic fields, detecting variations imperceptible to most observers without instrumentation. This heightened sensitivity, which he experienced sometimes as blessing and sometimes as burden, informed both his technical work and his personal habits. Certain environments became uncomfortable due to electromagnetic configurations others could not detect. Certain materials created distinctive sensory impressions beyond their visible or tactile properties. This expanded perceptual range, while occasionally overwhelming, provided direct experiential access to phenomena others could engage only theoretically or through instrumental mediation. Beyond technical advantage, this sensitivity created intimate relationship with the invisible energetic dimensions permeating physical reality, a constant awareness of presence beyond conventional perception. Throughout his work with electrical phenomena, Tesla developed what he called tactile vision, the ability to recognize patterns through physical sensation that remained invisible to optical observation alone. When working with high-frequency currents, subtle variations registered through his fingertips, through the surface of his skin, creating multisensory understanding of electrical behavior. This integration of touch and sight allowed simultaneous engagement with both measurable parameters and qualitative characteristics, perceiving both the mathematical values and the experiential qualities of various electrical configurations. This complementary relationship between quantitative and qualitative perception reflected his broader integration of multiple sensing modalities throughout his observational practice. The concept of perceptual threshold remained central to Tesla's understanding of human sensing. Having recognized the limitations of unassisted observation, he developed what he called extension practices, methods for amplifying subtle signals just below conventional detection limits. These approaches, which combined instrumental assistance with attentional refinement, allowed access to perceptual territories at the boundary between the apparent and the invisible, the liminal zones where phenomena begin to emerge into detectability. This exploration of threshold regions, of the borderlands between the perceptible and imperceptible, reflected his broader interest in transition states throughout natural systems, the critical boundaries where significant transformations occur just beyond ordinary awareness. Tesla maintained unusual relationship with what he called the feeling tone of different materials and configurations. Beyond understanding technical properties, he cultivated sensitivity to the distinctive qualitative signatures of various substances and arrangements, the particular sensory atmospheres that surrounded different experimental setups. These atmospheric perceptions, which registered as integrated impressions rather than isolated data points, informed his intuitive navigation of complex systems, allowing rapid recognition of proper functioning or emerging problems before conventional measurements could detect significant changes. This attention to overall system temperament, to the holistic feeling of different configurations, reflected his broader integration of analytical and synthetic awareness throughout his observational practice. Throughout his sensory experience, Tesla developed increasingly refined discrimination between what he termed signal patterns and noise patterns in perceptual data. Beyond simple filtering, he cultivated nuanced recognition of meaningful variations within apparent randomness, identifying subtle regularities that indicated significant relationships rather than merely statistical fluctuations. This attentional refinement, which combined analytical assessment with intuitive recognition, allowed him to extract relevant information from complex perceptual fields that appeared to less practiced observers as merely chaotic. This balanced relationship with complexity, this ability to perceive order within apparent disorder without imposing artificial simplification, reflected his broader appreciation for natural pattern within seeming randomness throughout physical and conceptual systems. The synesthetic dimensions of Tesla's perception remained largely private throughout his life. In personal notes, he occasionally referenced experiencing distinctive color impressions in response to certain electromagnetic frequencies, particular sound qualities when observing specific material resonances. These cross-modal experiences, which created natural bridges between different sensing channels, allowed simultaneous engagement with multiple aspects of phenomena through complementary perceptual pathways. Beyond unusual subjective experience, these synesthetic perceptions provided additional information channels, ways of recognizing patterns through their distinctive cross-sensory signatures rather than through single-mode observation alone. This integration of multiple sensing modalities reflected his broader understanding of perception as inherently multidimensional rather than confined to conventional categorical boundaries. Tesla developed increasingly nuanced relationship with what he called the texture of silence, the qualitative differences between various forms of apparent absence. Beyond recognizing mere presence or absence of sound, he cultivated sensitivity to the distinctive characteristics of different quiet states, the particular atmospheric qualities of various silent environments. This attention to the specific nature of different silences informed both his experimental practice and his personal habits, creating awareness of how certain forms of quiet facilitated particular modes of perception and cognition. This differentiated rather than generic approach to absence reflected his broader recognition that seemingly empty states possess distinctive properties that significantly influence both observation and understanding. Throughout his perceptual practice, Tesla maintained awareness of what he termed harmonic relationship between different sensing modalities. Having recognized that various observational approaches revealed complementary aspects of the same phenomena, he developed methods for integrating information across different channels, combining what was heard, seen, and felt into comprehensive understanding that transcended the limitations of any single mode. This cross-sensory integration allowed simultaneous engagement with both the measurable parameters accessible through instrumentation and the qualitative dimensions available through direct experience. This complementary relationship between different ways of sensing reflected his broader appreciation for multiple knowledge pathways throughout his investigative methodology. The concept of perceptual resolution remained central to Tesla's observational approach. Beyond general acuity, he cultivated what he called scaled attention, the ability to adjust perceptual focus to different magnitudes, to shift smoothly between macro and micro awareness. This flexible resolution, which he applied across sensing modalities, allowed movement between broad pattern recognition and precise detail observation without losing relationship between different scales. Unlike fixed focus approaches, which typically sacrifice either context or specificity, this adjustable attention created continuous perceptual connection between different magnitudes, maintaining awareness of how fine details participated in larger patterns while simultaneously recognizing how large-scale structures manifested in specific elements. This integrated cross-scale perception reflected his broader understanding of reality as consisting of nested relationships rather than isolated phenomena. Tesla maintained unusual sensitivity to what he called edge conditions in sensory fields, the transition zones between different perceptual territories. Beyond attending to central areas of clear signal, he cultivated awareness of boundary regions, where patterns began to emerge or dissolve, where familiar configurations transformed into different arrangements. This attention to perceptual borderlands allowed recognition of subtle transitions that remained invisible to observation, focused exclusively on established patterns. Beyond specific applications, this sensitivity to emergence and dissolution, to the dynamic boundaries between different states, reflected his broader interest in transformation processes throughout natural systems, the critical transition points, where significant change occurs through reconfiguration of relationship patterns. Temporal patterns. Throughout his life, Tesla maintained complex relationship with what he called the texture of duration, the qualitative differences between various forms of temporal experience. Beyond measured time, he attended to the distinctive characteristics of different temporal states, how certain periods seem to expand or contract depending on attentional quality, environmental conditions, and engagement type. This awareness of time's variable nature informed both his work rhythms and his experimental protocols, creating recognition that different processes required not just different durations, but different temporal qualities. This differentiated, rather than uniform approach to temporality, reflected his broader understanding that time itself possesses multiple dimensions beyond simple chronological progression. The concept of appropriate timing remained central to Tesla's approach to both experimentation and implementation. Beyond following predetermined schedules, he cultivated what he called temporal sensitivity, awareness of the optimal moments, for particular actions based on the convergence of multiple factors rather than arbitrary timetables. This attention to natural timing, to the recognition of when conditions most favored specific developments, informed his patience during experimental plateaus and his decisive action when circumstances aligned. This relationship with timing as emergent rather than imposed reflected his broader appreciation for working with, rather than against, inherent rhythms throughout natural and technical systems. Tesla developed increasingly refined awareness of what he termed developmental sequences in both natural processes and human innovation. Beyond perceiving isolated events, he attended to the characteristic patterns through which various phenomena evolved over time, the typical progressions, regressions, and transformations that mark different types of change. This sensitivity to temporal signatures allowed him to recognize where particular developments stood within their larger evolutionary arcs, providing context for current conditions and guidance for appropriate next steps. This temporal pattern recognition reflected his broader understanding that change itself follows characteristic rhythms dependent on the essential nature of what is changing, rather than proceeding through generic progression regardless of content. Throughout his experimental practice, Tesla maintained awareness of what he called the simultaneous present, the recognition that any moment contains multiple concurrent temporal processes operating at different rates and scales. Beyond attending to single time frames, he cultivated perception of how various rhythms intersected within the same chronological period, how electrical oscillations, material responses, atmospheric conditions, and even his own biological cycles created complex temporal counterpoint rather than uniform progression. This multi-temporal awareness allowed him to coordinate interventions that addressed multiple intersecting processes simultaneously rather than focusing on isolated timelines. This stereoscopic relationship with time reflected his broader appreciation for complexity rather than reduction throughout his understanding of natural systems. The integration of cyclical and linear temporality remained essential to Tesla's approach. Having recognized both progressive and recurring aspects of natural change, he developed what he called spiral thinking, a temporal framework that unified advancement and return, evolution and repetition. Unlike purely cyclical models, which suggested mere recurrence without development, or strictly linear perspectives, which ignored significant pattern repetition, this spiral understanding allowed simultaneous appreciation for how processes both revisited familiar territories and moved into new domains. This complementary relationship between different temporal patterns reflected his broader integration of apparently opposing frameworks throughout his conceptual approach. Tesla maintained unusual awareness of what he termed incubation periods in both material processes and cognitive development. Beyond expecting immediate results, he recognized the essential importance of apparently inactive phases, times when significant change occurred below the threshold of visible transformation. This attention to invisible development informed his patience with both experimental progressions and his own understanding, allowing necessary maturation without premature intervention. This recognition of gestation as productive rather than merely inactive reflected his broader appreciation for the essential role of apparent stillness within larger patterns of change, the necessary intervals during which new configurations form before becoming manifest. Throughout his work rhythms, Tesla developed increasingly refined relationship with what he called appropriate duration, the recognition that different processes possess inherent temporal requirements based on their essential natures. Beyond applying standardized timeframes, he cultivated sensitivity to how long particular developments naturally required, allowing chemical reactions, electrical stabilizations, and material adaptations the specific periods they needed, rather than imposing uniform schedules. This attention to inherent, rather than arbitrary timing, reflected his broader understanding that natural processes unfold according to their own necessary temporalities, rather than conforming to externally imposed timetables, regardless of their essential characteristics. The concept of sequential relationship remained central to Tesla's understanding of both natural and technological development. Beyond perceiving isolated stages, he attended to what he called the connective tissue between different phases, the critical transition zones where one state transformed into another. This sensitivity to interstage dynamics, to the precise mechanisms through which change propagated from one condition to the next, informed both his experimental design and his implementation strategies, creating awareness of how earlier stages could be structured to facilitate rather than hinder subsequent developments. This attention to developmental coherence, to the continuity between different phases, reflected his broader appreciation for relationship rather than isolation throughout his understanding of transformative processes. Tesla maintained complex awareness of what he termed temporal horizons in both perception and planning. Beyond focusing exclusively on immediate conditions, he cultivated simultaneous engagement with multiple time frames, attending to present details while maintaining awareness of both historical context and future implications. This multi-horizon thinking allowed him to position current work within larger developmental trajectories, understanding how present actions emerged from past conditions and would influence future possibilities. This stereoscopic relationship with time, this refusal to isolate present from its temporal extensions, reflected his broader integration of contextual and specific awareness throughout his experimental and theoretical practice. Throughout his life, Tesla developed increasingly nuanced understanding of what he called phase transitions in various processes, the critical thresholds where systems undergo fundamental reorganization rather than merely incremental change. Beyond attending to gradual development, he cultivated sensitivity to these transformative boundaries, the specific conditions where materials shifted state, where electrical patterns reconfigured, where mechanical systems reorganized their functional relationships. This attention to critical transition points, to the precise circumstances that triggered qualitative, rather than merely quantitative change, reflected his broader interest in transformation rather than simple accumulation throughout natural and technological systems. His recognition that development occurs not just through continuous gradation, but through discrete leaps between different organizational states. Meditative awareness. The quality of Tesla's attention during periods of deep focus resembled certain meditative states described across contemplative traditions. Beyond conventional concentration, he cultivated what he called transparent awareness, condition wherein the usual boundary between observer and observed temporarily dissolved, creating direct participation in the patterns being studied rather than separated analysis. These states, which typically emerge during prolonged engagement with particular problems, allowed perception of relationships that remained invisible from more conventional observational positions. While maintaining scientific rigor in his formal work, these experiences informed his intuitive navigation of complex systems, enabling recognition of essential patterns without requiring exhaustive analysis of each component element. Throughout his experimental practice, Tesla developed increasingly refined relationship with what he called effortless attention, the capacity to maintain complete focus without strain or depletion. Unlike forced concentration, which he found created perceptual distortion and rapid fatigue, this natural attentiveness emerged through alignment with rather than imposition upon his cognitive tendencies. This sustainable awareness, which combined Precision with relaxation allowed extended periods of deep engagement without the deterioration typically associated with prolonged mental effort. This balanced relationship with attention, this integration of intensity and ease, reflected his broader understanding that optimal function in any system requires harmony between engagement and openness, rather than maximization of any single quality. Tesla maintained unusual awareness of what he termed the witnessing position in consciousness, the capacity to observe not just external phenomena, but the movement of his own thought processes. Beyond being absorbed in conceptual content, he cultivated what contemplative traditions sometimes call metacognitive awareness, the ability to recognize patterns in his own thinking without becoming identified with specific thoughts. This reflective capacity allowed him to notice when his conceptual frameworks became restrictive rather than facilitative, providing freedom to shift perspectives when existing approaches reached limitations. This relationship with thought as tool rather than identity reflected his broader understanding that conceptual models serve rather than define the consciousness that employs them. The integration of analytical and holistic awareness remained essential to Tesla's approach. Having recognized the complementary value of both detailed examination and gestalt perception, he developed what he called simultaneous knowing, the capacity to attend concurrently to specific elements and their integrated relationships. Unlike sequential shifting between different perceptual modes, this stereoscopic attention allowed continuous awareness of both particular components and the emergent patterns they collectively created. This balanced relationship between part and whole, between focused precision and contextual understanding, reflected his broader appreciation for complementarity rather than opposition between different ways of knowing throughout his observational and conceptual practices. Throughout his life, Tesla cultivated awareness of what he called the gap between thoughts, the spaces of mental silence that punctuated his analytical processes. Beyond valuing active thinking, he recognized the essential importance of these intervals, not as absences but as fertile openings through which new patterns could emerge. These apparent voids, which he deliberately incorporated into his cognitive rhythm, created the necessary conditions for reorganization below the threshold of directed attention. This appreciation for the productivity of silence, for the generative potential of apparent emptiness, reflected his broader understanding that creation requires alternation between formation and dissolution, between presence and space. Tesla developed increasingly refined relationship with what he termed quality of presence, the particular attentional characteristics he brought to different aspects of his work. Beyond simply being focused or unfocused, he cultivated specific types of awareness appropriate for different activities, bringing curious exploration to initial investigation, precise discrimination to detailed analysis, receptive openness to integrative phases. This differentiated rather than generic approach to attention reflected his recognition that different cognitive processes require distinct qualities of mental engagement, that thinking itself possesses multiple modalities, each with particular strengths and limitations depending on the nature of what is being considered. The balance between effort and receptivity remained central to Tesla's attentional practice. Having recognized that certain insights emerged not through striving, but through allowing, he developed what contemplative traditions sometimes call effortless effort, the capacity to remain fully engaged without forcing particular outcomes. This balanced attention, which combined clear intention with genuine openness to unexpected developments, created optimal conditions for discovery, maintaining direction without sacrificing receptivity to unanticipated possibilities. This complementary relationship between purpose and acceptance reflected his broader integration of apparently opposing qualities throughout his approach to both experimental and theoretical work. Throughout his observational practice, Tesla maintained awareness of what he called perceptual prejudice, the tendency for expectations to shape what is perceived. Beyond accepting initial impressions, he cultivated what phenomenologists term bracketing, the deliberate suspension of preconceptions to allow phenomena to reveal themselves according to their own inherent patterns, rather than conforming to anticipated characteristics. This continual refresh of perception, this returning to direct observation rather than theoretical overlay, allowed him to recognize aspects that remained invisible to more conceptually determined observation. This commitment to seeing freshly, rather than merely confirming existing understanding, reflected his broader dedication to discovery rather than mere verification throughout his experimental approach. Tesla developed increasingly nuanced relationship with what he called appropriate clarity, the recognition that different perceptual fields require different degrees of resolution depending on their essential characteristics. Beyond seeking maximum precision in all domains, he cultivated sensitivity to the optimal level of definiteness for various phenomena, allowing certain patterns to remain slightly diffuse when their inherent nature involved ambiguity or transition. This contextual rather than absolute approach to clarity reflected his understanding that forcing excessive definition sometimes distorted rather than revealed, that certain realities manifested most accurately through degrees of precision aligned with their intrinsic qualities rather than through imposition of uniform sharpness, regardless of subject matter. The concept of perceptual patience remained essential to Tesla's observational methodology. Beyond expecting immediate comprehension, he cultivated what he called extended witnessing, the willingness to remain attentive to phenomena over prolonged periods, allowing patterns to gradually reveal themselves through accumulated observation rather than rushed analysis. This temporal generosity, this refusal to prematurely conclude observation based on initial impressions, created space for subtle relationships to become apparent, for connections invisible in shorter timeframes to emerge through sustained attention. This unhurried relationship with perception reflected his broader appreciation for natural development throughout his experimental and theoretical practice. His recognition that understanding often requires alignment with the inherent temporal rhythms of what is being observed, rather than acceleration to match human impatience. Gentle closure. As our exploration of Tesla's remarkable mind begins to settle, I invite you to release any effort to remember specific details, allowing the essence of what we've shared to find its own natural place within your awareness. Perhaps what remains is not the precise chronology of his discoveries or the technical specifications of his inventions, but something more subtle, a sense of how one human consciousness moved through the world with unusual receptivity to both visible and invisible patterns. Tesla's journey suggests that our perceptions shape the reality we experience, that the questions we ask determine the answers we receive, and that sometimes the most significant insights emerge not from straining toward what we don't know, but from truly seeing what lies before us. As you continue toward rest, you might carry with you not Tesla's knowledge, but his quality of attention, his willingness to perceive freshly, to notice what others overlooked, to find relationship between apparently separate domains. The electrical currents that fascinated him continue to flow through the world around you, through the devices that illuminate your room, through the very nervous system that carries your thoughts and sensations. In this way, his legacy surrounds you as you move towards sleep. Whether electricity flows through copper wires or thoughts flow through human awareness, certain principles remain. Resonance creates connection. Patterns repeat across different scales, and sometimes the most profound discoveries arrive not through effort, but through receptive alignment with what already exists. Rest well, dream peacefully, and perhaps awaken, carrying not Tesla's specific insights, but his fundamental recognition. That reality contains infinite depths available to those willing to adjust their perception, to look beyond conventional boundaries, and to maintain genuine wonder before the elegant patterns that surround us at every moment. As you drift towards sleep, may you find comfort in knowing that the same universal principles that Tesla explored continue their dance through all things, visible and invisible, known and unknown, manifest and potential, creating the ever-unfolding pattern of existence within which your own consciousness participates. Good night. Gentle closure. As our time together draws toward its natural conclusion, I invite you to hold gently the patterns we've explored in Tesla's remarkable mind, not as facts to be remembered, but as whispers that might echo in your own thoughts as you drift towards sleep. Perhaps what remains is not the specific details of his inventions or the particular dates of his discoveries, but something more essential, the recognition that within each human mind lies capacity for both precision and wonder, for both careful observation and expansive vision. Tesla's journey reminds us that our perceptions shape the world we experience, that what we attend to gradually becomes what we see, and that sometimes the most valuable discoveries wait just beyond the boundaries of conventional attention. As you continue toward rest, perhaps you might carry with you not Tesla's knowledge, but his quality of awareness, his willingness to perceive patterns others missed, to find harmony in apparent chaos, to trust insights that arrived through unexpected channels. In these final moments together, I invite you to release any effort to remember what we've shared, allowing your consciousness to move according to its own natural rhythms, perhaps carrying fragments of Tesla's wisdom into your dreams, or perhaps leaving them behind in favor of your own inner landscapes. Whether electricity flows through copper wires or thoughts flow through human awareness, certain principles remain. Connection matters. Resonance creates movement. And sometimes the most profound discoveries arrive not through effort, but through receptivity. Rest well, dream peacefully, and perhaps awaken carrying not specific memories of our exploration, but a quiet appreciation for the remarkable patterns that flow through all things, through history, through nature, through technology, and through the consciousness that connects us to each of these realms in ways both mysterious and beautiful. Good night.